Hello, and welcome back to another video to fall asleep to. In this video, we will be talking about Australia cricket. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If English cricket is a novel about tradition and class, Australian cricket is a Western. It is a story of outlaws, pioneers, and a ruthless pursuit of dominance. To wear the baggy green cap is not just to represent a team. It is to embody the spirit of a nation that has spent the last century and a half proving it bows to absolutely no one. This is the history of Australian cricket, a story of brilliance, brutality, and the heavy price of perfection. Act 1. The First Pioneers and the Demon. To find the true genesis of Australian cricket, we must look past the aristocratic clubs of Sydney and Melbourne. The first Australian sporting team to ever tour internationally was not a group of white colonists. It was a team of Aboriginal men in 1868. Led by a star all-rounder named Johnny Mulla, these First Nations players boarded a ship for a perilous journey to England. They played 47 matches in just 6 months across the English countryside. They were treated as a curiosity, a spectacle, but they played with immense skill and pride. It is a foundational chapter of the Australian sporting story that was ignored for far too long, but it established a precedent. Australians were willing to cross the world to prove themselves on the biggest stage. 14 years later, the white colonial team made their own mark. We know the story of 1882 at the Oval. We know how Fred, the Demon, Spofforth, tore through the English batting lineup to win the match and give birth to the Ashes. But look at why Spofforth was so angry. Before that match, an English batsman had run out an Australian player in a manner that Spofforth deemed deeply unsporting. In the dressing room, Spofforth raged. He looked at his teammates and growled, "This thing can be done." That is the bedrock of Australian cricket. It is not just about skill. It is about righteous fury. It is about an absolute, unshakable belief that you can impose your will upon the opposition. Act 2. The Boy from Bowral and the Invincibles. As Australia grew from a collection of colonies into a federated nation, it needed a hero. It needed a symbol of its own exceptionalism. And in the 1920s, it found one in a boy from the rural town of Bowral, New South Wales, Sir Donald Bradman. The speaker paces slowly, emphasizing the weight of the name. In the history of global sports, there are greats, and there are statistical anomalies: Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky, Muhammad Ali. But none of them dominate their sport's historical record quite like Bradman. He finished his career with a batting average of 99.94. The next best in the history of the game are in the low 60s. He was twice as good as any man who has ever lived. Bradman was a machine. He was cold, calculating, and utterly unyielding. When England devised bodyline in 1932, hurling the ball at his head to stop him, Australia didn't just see it as a sporting tactic. They saw it as an assault by the mother country on their greatest son. It united the nation in outrage. After the Second World War, Bradman took his ultimate revenge. He captained the 1948 team to England. They didn't just win, they went entirely undefeated on a 34-match tour. They were crowned the Invincibles. They were the blueprint. They established the expectation that for Australia, winning wasn't enough. You had to dominate. Act 3. Chest hair, gold chains, and revolution. Let us jump forward to the 1970s. The world was changing, television was exploding, and Australian cricket found its swagger. This was the era of Ian Chappell. Chappell was a captain who treated a cricket field like a street fight. He didn't want gentlemen in his team. He wanted street fighters. He wanted men who would look the English or the West Indians dead in the eye and refuse to blink. He had his weapons: Dennis Lillee and Jeff Thompson. Fast bowlers with flowing hair, unbuttoned shirts, gold chains, and a terrifying lust for intimidation. They bowled at the speed of light and aimed for the ribcage. It was macho, it was aggressive, and the Australian public adored it. But they were also grossly underpaid by the Conservative Cricket Board. So, when a media tycoon named Kerry Packer came along in 1977 and offered the players a fortune to break away and form a rebel league, they took it. World Series cricket was a revolution. Packer introduced night matches under floodlights. He introduced colored clothing. He introduced multiple camera angles and stump microphones. The traditionalists howled in protest, but Packer and the Australian players dragged the Victorian sport of cricket, kicking and screaming, into the modern commercial age. They proved that Australian cricketers weren't just athletes. They were prime-time entertainment. Act 4. The Era of Mental Disintegration. Every empire falls, and in the 1980s, Australia hit rock bottom. The West Indies were pummeling them, and the team was fractured. The man tasked with picking up the pieces was Alan Border. Captain Grumpy. Border was a man of sheer, stubborn grit. He demanded absolute loyalty and a frighteningly hard edge. He pulled Australian cricket out of the dirt by sheer force of will, winning the 1987 World Cup and reclaiming the Ashes in 1989. But Border only laid the foundation. The men who built the castle were Steve Waugh and Ricky Ponting. The speaker stops, looking directly at the audience, their voice dropping to a serious tenor. From the late 1990s through the 2000s, Australia assembled arguably the greatest cricket team in the history of the sport. Shane Warne, Glenn McGrath, Adam Gilchrist, Matthew Hayden. But it wasn't just their talent that made them terrifying. It was their philosophy. Steve Waugh coined a phrase, mental disintegration. The Australians realized that you didn't have to bowl a ball at a man's head to break him. You could break his mind. They mastered the dark art of sledging, verbal abuse and psychological pressure out on the pitch. When a new batsman walked out to the middle, he was surrounded by fielders who would question his technique, his courage, and occasionally his personal life. They were relentless. They squeezed the oxygen out of the opposition. They won a record 16 consecutive test matches. They won 3 consecutive World Cups. They were predators, and the rest of the cricketing world was prey. They were respected, admired, and deeply, deeply hated. Act 5. The Line and the Fall. But here is the danger of building a culture entirely around aggressive dominance. When winning at all costs is the only metric of success, the moral compass begins to spin wildly. The Australians always talked about the line. They claimed they played hard, but they never crossed the line. But as the golden generation retired and a new era of players took over, the pressure to maintain that impossible standard became toxic. It culminated in March 2018. Cape Town, South Africa. The speaker steps back, shaking their head slightly. It is a word that still makes Australian cricket fans wince. Sandpapergate. Caught on television cameras, an Australian player was seen rubbing a piece of yellow sandpaper on the cricket ball to illegally alter its aerodynamics. It was blatant, premeditated cheating. The fallout was apocalyptic. The captain, Steve Smith, and the vice-captain, David Warner, were sent home in tears and banned for a year. The Prime Minister of Australia went on national television to express his disgust. In England, ball tampering is a sporting offence. In Australia, it was treated as a crime against the national identity. Because the baggy green cap isn't just supposed to represent winning, it is supposed to represent a tough but fair Australian egalitarianism. They had disgraced the cap. The myth of Australian moral superiority had shattered. Act 6. Redemption in the Sun. The rebuild was painful. The team had to learn how to be liked again, both by the world and by their own public. They hired a new coach, Justin Langer, who preached about humility and character. They appointed Tim Paine, a mild-mannered wicketkeeper, to steady the ship. But true redemption required a new kind of leader. It required someone who embodied the fast bowling menace of the past, but the emotional intelligence of the future. Enter Pat Cummins. Cummins is a smiling assassin. He is a terrifyingly brilliant fast bowler, but as a captain, he threw out the toxic, hypermasculine playbook of mental disintegration. He encouraged his players to be themselves, to be calm, to be analytical rather than strictly aggressive. Under Cummins, Australia has found a new way to conquer the world. In 2023, they traveled to India, the most difficult place on earth to win, and beat the heavily favored Indian team to win the World Test Championship. A few months later, in front of 130,000 screaming Indian fans in Ahmedabad, they beat India again to win their 6th World Cup. They did it without the venom of the 90s. They did it with cold, clinical execution. The speaker walked slowly to the center of the stage, looking out as if staring into a vast stadium. So, what is the history of Australian cricket? It is a mirror held up to a young country trying to forge its identity. It is the story of men who took a polite English pastime and weaponized it under the hot sun. From the Aboriginal pioneers of 1868 to the mechanical genius of Bradman, to the swagger of Warne and the redemption of Cummins, the thread remains unbroken. It is a belief that when you walk out onto the grass wearing that baggy green